After having rebuffed the Italian, she finally agrees to go on a night walk with him. And this is our last extract. When they turned down the dark and narrow path, lined by hedges of scrub that scratched against their legs, Chi-Chi looped his arm through hers. A slight trembling went through her at the touch of his arm, but she let him do it. They continued in silence. Only Chi-Chi's breathing now was heavy, irregular, audible. Gina felt uneasy. His evident excitement was communicating itself to her, was beginning imperceptibly to master her inward self. What had happened to her all of a sudden? Her limbs were invaded by a strange exhaustion, a kind of paralysis. Walking became difficult for her. A sort of animal stupor filled her that veiled her mind in fog, like the heavy numbness after drinking strong liquor. The pressure of his muscular arm was obscurely felt by her, as though at a certain distance from the zone of her being. The rugged path, jutting with broken stone, she barely saw. She went on like a sleepwalker. They reached a little clearing. The narrow brook alongside it poured a faint murmur into the body of stillness. In a far-off corner of Gina's soul, there flickered a feeling that she had always been walking on this path, that she would continue to walk on it till the end of days, bound up with the delicate murmur and the fragrant night, and even with this alien man. It seemed as though all her past life had been drawn out of her, and the possibility of her future life as well. Unconsciously, she sank down on the slope of the brook's channel. And Chi-Chi was there sprawled at her feet, whispering in a hot breath unintelligible words. No, Gina understood nothing. She sensed only that her body was burning as though racked by a high fever, and Chi-Chi's searing, biting kisses on her hands, her bared arms, her neck, her face. The kisses had in them something of the pounce of a terrible beast, of murder. She did not try to protest. She was not capable. And had he intended to kill her, she would not have protested. Again, she had no control over herself. She vaguely felt that something was being done in her body, something at once terrible and the source of killing pleasure, but all that as in a nightmare, as an irrevocable, irresistible decree. Especially because this moment recalls so many analogues in European literature. English readers will most naturally think of D.H. Lawrence, both in regard to the situation and the kind of language used to convey it. Vogel's achievement as Hebrew stylist is not adequately represented by the translation. Although in the half-century since these paragraphs were composed, the Hebrew language has in most respects undergone changes as extensive, perhaps, as those undergone by English and French since the 18th century. This prose still seems remarkably contemporary, as though the author had created back in 1932 a kind of matrix for standard novelistic diction in Hebrew. I mean, I realize there's no such thing, but this is an approximation. In fact, that creation, as all of our readings have been intended to show, was a collective enterprise, not the work of one writer. The critically formative period running roughly from 1886 to 1930. Vogel is able to move with the assurance he does because he can draw on the stylistic achievements and lexical innovations of others, as well as on a certain solidification of general usage when he makes his own fine stylistic synthesis. Some of this assurance is observable in purely mechanical details that would of course be taken for granted in the literary use of a normal spoken language. Vogel knows, for example, exactly the right idiomatic Hebrew, the verb shilev, for someone slipping his arm inside another person's arm, a usage that Gnessen 3 decades earlier, in a passage we had occasion to consider, did not have under control. The external features of the scene, rapidly sketched in accordance with the prevailing economy of report of the novella, are all admirably precise. The scratchy hedge of scrub growth along the narrow path, the rocky, uneven surface, the quiet susurration or faint murmur, mashak tsanua, of the brook. I proposed earlier that despite the immense differences among individual novelists, there is a prevalent generic way of talking and thinking which might be thought of as standard novelistic, at least for a good part of the realist tradition from the 18th century onward. One of the characteristics of this generic lingua franca would be the fondness for shuttling between concretely specific details of physical reality and the experiencing mind on which they impinge, which variously feels itself or finds itself in them, in those concrete details. Especially when erotic experience is at issue, this shuttling movement is often given a triadic or three-part structure, as in our passage from Facing the Sea: external reality, inward state, and the body of the human subject, which serves as a threshold between the two. Vogel's emphasis falls on the last two of these three, that is, inward state and the body. And the vocabulary he calls on for rendering them is rich and precise. He catches the changing nuances of the woman's kinesthetic apprehension of the man at her side, the trembling that runs through her at the touch of his arm, the strange sense of fatigue or numbness that spreads through her limbs, the feeling of feverish body heat, the progressive dissociation of physical sensation from volitional perception, as when the pressure of Chi-Chi's arm is, in the passive voice, obscurely felt by her, in the Hebrew, hurgashala bisatum. What gives the whole passage psychological density is the writer's ability to provide, in conjunction with this rendering of the body as it undergoes experience, a kind of analytic narration of consciousness. I don't think that storytelling and analysis in novels are mutually exclusive. I think they often happen together, as here. He introduces a couple of small fragments of narrated monologue. Everyone now knows what that is, as what had happened to her all of a sudden. That's really what she's saying to herself. Or, no, Gina understood nothing, and perhaps also, had he intended to kill her, she would have not protested. The burden of the scene, however, is carried by a highly mediated version of consciousness, the narrator providing language that would not be available to Gina herself. In some instances, this involves the report of ideas or images that clearly occur to her, her fantasy of walking on the narrow path forever, entangled in night and sound and man, her masochistic glimpse into the abyss of sadistic, aggressive male sexuality in the image of the terrible pouncing beast, the intimation of murder. At other points, a strategic role is played by the narrator's nice control of metaphor for the representation of her inner state, as in the animal stupor recalling the numbing effect of strong drink that clouds her consciousness. In executing this complex moment of psycho-narration, that is narrating what's going on in the psyche, Vogel is able to utilize a whole spectrum of finely shaded terms for different inner states or aspects of the self, not all of which, I'm afraid, are very effectively represented in my translation. His success, in other words, is equally a testimony to his own artistic gift and to the general maturation of modern Hebrew by the time he wrote. Thus, Chi-Chi's condition of excitement masters or conquers Gina's inward self, yeshut, an abstraction that means something like essence, or literally isness, first coined for the purposes of medieval Hebrew philosophy, and here used in a sense that straddles the metaphysical, where it first comes in the Middle Ages, and the psychological. Then it is her mind, da'at, that becomes veiled in fog, a standard Hebrew term which goes all the way back to the Bible and is particularly associated with the cognitive aspect of consciousness. Feelings at this point begin to be apprehended obscurely, obliquely, at a certain distance from what I have translated rather literally as the zone of her being. This last term, being, havaya, the most comprehensive that Vogel uses for the self, is a verbal noun from the root to be, first used in rabbinic sources in the sense of that which is, and typically used by modern writers to mean something like essential being, fundamental ontological state. Through this progression of terms, then, Vogel traces the successive stages of a cleavage in the character between being and experience. The new world of experience has terrors and pleasures, unassimilable by the conscious mind and the concepts of identity by which that mind sustains itself. Gina's weirdly dissociated perception at the end of the sexual act as something that was being done in or to her culminates this whole development and as a terrific force, I think, of psychological conviction. It becomes clear how the language has been imaginatively redeployed so that it is able to convey a vision of self and world beyond the purview of classical Hebrew culture. In one respect, and with this I approach my conclusion, it may be misleading to think, as we've been doing, of Vogel's case as the exceptional working out of a cultural hypothesis that was cut off by subsequent history. Literary Hebrew, it would seem, was already in rapid progress, in a rapid process of normalization during Vogel's own lifetime, like Jewish existence itself, in the national Jewish homeland. The stylistic fumblings, however, the painful artificialities of the prose produced by the first generation of native Hebrew writers who came of age in the 1940s suggest that the move from vernacular to literary language is by no means a simple or natural one. And for a variety of historical reasons, it may be more complicated in Hebrew than in many other languages. It is surely instructive that Hebrew literary prose of the 70s and 80s begins to sound more like Vogel than like the prose of its immediate forebears, the writers of the generation in 1948. The project of creating an authentically European fiction in Hebrew without a national context and without a vernacular base was surely anomalous, but it bore witness both to the resources of expression inherent in the language and to the uncanny binding force of the language as a medium of cultural identity, beyond religion and even beyond any kind of political nationalism. To make Hebrew think in a radically new way was what the rabbis, 2 millennia earlier, under the pressure of Aramaic, Greek, Latin, and a transformed social political world, had done with biblical Hebrew. And what 1,000 years later, in very different directions, the great medieval poets, and that is Hebrew poets, and the Jewish philosophers or their Hebrew translators did under the pressure of Arabic language and literature and Greek thought. To be sure, these earlier historical transitions took place in circumstances in which Jews, for the most part, still lived in distinct, internally coherent cultural enclaves within the dominant culture. And in this regard, the transition into modernity has been far more disjunctive. There were, of course, broader roads than Hebrew that Jews could take into modernity, whether by ridding themselves of most of the baggage, linguistic or otherwise, of Jewish tradition, or by embracing the vernacular Yiddish as the instrument of modern identity. Only Hebrew, however, satisfied the desire to preserve continuity with 3,000 years of national experience. To make it into an instrument for the representation of a reality where no living Hebrew voices really spoke was surely to work against the grain. But perhaps all literary use of language, however strong the illusion of mimesis, involves more working against the grain of ordinary language than we are willing to admit. Vogel, Gnessen, Berdichevsky, Brenner, and Mendele made it possible to imagine the world in Hebrew, even as they preserved many of the language's historical resonances in terms more radically new than those of any modern Jewish ideology or theology, made it possible to conceive men and women, mind and matter, individual and society, moment and memory in a whole new set of perspectives. Like all writers, they offered no solutions to the problems of existence, only the imaginative and linguistic means for thinking about the problems, for seeing them with a depth of vision. The Hebrew movement has never been more than an embattled elite, but for the profundity of its immersion in modernity while holding on to a lifeline to the past, future generations of Jews will continue to be in its debt. Thank you.